Hello, everyone. I am Christoffer Dohlen, and here I am discussing some interesting topics about politics, philosophy, etc. With a very interesting guy from Switzerland, Amos Zweig. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. I am, as Christopher said, my name is Amos Zweig. I live here in Switzerland. I have been interested in philosophy for around 15 years now, mostly self-taught on YouTube. And so Christopher commented on a video that I made, and I thought his comment was very interesting, and so we decided to have some philosophical discussions together. So I hope you will enjoy it. So yes, we were talking about a very interesting topic, which is that it seems that there is always a dominant narrative or ideology in any society, but somehow people today think that here in the West this is not the case, that everyone can have their own ideals and follow their own values. But as we were saying, this is it's an illusion. It's not the case.
Exactly. It's a very problematic view, one could say, because this liberal philosophy that every single individual in a society could just believe whatever they want, have whatever private individual values they can hold for themselves, that would just work perfectly, that you don't need any unifying social dominant ideology sort of presenting itself to society. You could just have everyone just going and do whatever they want, or at least have whatever kind of beliefs and values they want. They don't need to, they could just be separated from anyone else. But as we were talking about, this view is very problematic, because to separate society from values, that's not really how reality works at all. Rather, we see that there is always, as you said, some sort of philosophy or ideology, or at least set of ideas that will dominate a society, that will sort of ground the, you could say, metaphysical basis for that society. So in the Soviet Union, that ideology was communism. In the Middle Ages in Europe, that ideology was Catholicism. And in Nazi Germany, it was Nazism, etc., etc. And you could also say that today, in the Western sphere, the dominating ideology, since at least the end of World War II, has been liberalism. The secular, social, liberal ideology. That's the dominant set of values that we live with today.
Yes, and also one important clarification is that that it is true within a certain walled off box that people are free to follow their own values, but this box is quite narrow, and it is precisely defined by the society, and society will not let you step out of this box with your values without interfering. So for example, I am currently in the West. People are free to follow their religion. So you can be Jewish, you can be Christian, you can be atheist, Hindu, whatever. You can practice your religion as you want, but for example, you are, I think even by law, you are not allowed to say, I will only hire white men to work in my shop, or black women for that matter. It's just there is a law that you have to employ people irrespective of their skin color or gender. And if you will not follow this law, then you will be punished. And of course, this law also enforces a certain set of values, which is that skin color and gender don't matter, and you have to treat everybody equally. Like this is this creed that diversity is a good thing, and you have to act in accordance.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a very good point that even though many of the, you could say, liberal people of today say that we live in a free society where there is free speech, freedom of expression, there really is this philosophy that that restrains and suppress alternative philosophies that are too far off, you could say. Like you mentioned, if you are very critical of the modern idea of discrimination, that would be problematic. Now, of course, we are not saying by any means that to discriminate based on race or something like that that's a good thing. No, of course, we are not saying that, but we are simply pointing out that that's how the system works.
Yes.
And you see that if you go too far off from those liberal ideas and values, you would get in trouble. If you are, for instance, too traditionalist, conservative, you wouldn't exactly be looked very good upon. Or, for instance, if you are a Christian who refuses to bake a cake to a homosexual wedding, which had happened in the United States with Jack Phillips, I think his name was, in Colorado, not that many years ago. He got in trouble with the government because he refused to make such services to something that contradicted his own faith. And even though he won in Supreme Court, he was still very much troubled by all these local governments intervening and trying to punish him for not conforming to that creed of discrimination, non-discrimination and diversity, as you said. And of course, you have Twitter and Facebook and YouTube censoring a lot of material which contradicts their liberal philosophy. The modern institutions are suppressing alternative ideologies. That's something we need to be aware of.
Yes, and now also you could, of course, argue that that in a liberal state, the state should just be like the night watchman. So take care that nobody's life, liberty, or property is harmed. And other than that, the state shouldn't do these things that we have described now. But still, if you take this idea, there are still very many values that are somehow at the basis of society that that are enforced. So, for example, I think if you look at the founding fathers in the U.S. when they wrote this pretty good document, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. They probably didn't think about if people have to wear clothes in public. It was just so normal that this wasn't even considered. But of course, if I have my life, liberty, and property granted, then it doesn't say anywhere whether I should wear clothes. If my body is my property, then I can do with it what I want. So, and there are many similar examples that just show that there are values or ideas what proper behavior or interaction consists of and what it doesn't consist of, and a society enforces these views in some way or another.
Exactly. Yes. And that's just the reality around us. We cannot imagine a society that is value free. I remember discussing with a libertarian who argued that you could have a liberal society which is value free, that there is just people having their own values and that's it. But right, it's not how societies work. We haven't seen that being the case historically. And you mentioned the founding fathers, which many libertarians and liberals think they were espousing this liberal idea of complete freedom of speech, etc. But the interesting point is that just a very few years later, after the Constitution was written, then the government began to pass sedition laws under John Adams, I think it was, which made it criminal to publicly criticize the government and the actions of the government. So already in the very, very early days of the United States, you see that there is some mechanisms to suppress other, perhaps threatening ideas. And that's been the case all the way up to today.
Yes, and of course, I don't know, was it like 100 years or more or less after the foundation of the state, there was the War of Southern Independence, where like the most fundamental of these rights were in the end violently crushed. And we see again that violence is an absolutely essential and foundational effect in determining how human beings interact. And I think this is even more something that interests me at the moment, because you could say that at least a society can shift from one state of ideals and values to another. But this shift almost, or I don't know of any example where this shift has occurred peacefully. And well, there are maybe some examples, but like the secession of Czechoslovakia, where they split up into Czechia and Slovakia. So this happened peacefully. But in most cases, the shift of ideals happens through either war or revolution or like civil war, and then first the new structure establishes itself through violence until nobody wants to contest it anymore. And then you start to write down, okay, now what are the laws, the new laws?
Exactly. I'm just thinking of my own country, Norway, also as a great example of that. For instance, in the Renaissance era, in the 16th century, you had the Danish king forcing Norwegians to become Protestants and leave their older Catholic faith. And this Protestant religion has been very influential and inherent in the Norwegian society in the last centuries. But if you look at history, you see that the origins of that Protestant religion in Norway had very violent origins. You see that it was forced by the king upon Norwegians. They didn't have any choice. They had to just confine themselves to it. And it was a bloody thing. I think some people who resisted got killed. So it was a very bloody thing, which made Norway Protestant. And even in the later era, in the Enlightenment era, you had this Protestant framework forming the governing of Norway. So, for instance, when our constitution was written in 1814, it was one of the most liberal constitutions of the world. I think it was even more democratic and liberal than the United States Constitution. And yet, that constitution prohibited Jews from entering the country. It established Protestantism, or Lutheran Protestantism, as the state religion. It prohibited Jesuits and monks from entering Norway. So even one of the most liberal constitutions of the day had very clear restrictions on alternative value systems. And even though the prohibition against Jews entering the country was removed just some decades later, the prohibition of Jesuit priests entering the country, that was in force all the way until the 1950s. That's not very long ago. In this supposedly very liberal and tolerant society. So we see everywhere that, yeah, they try to appear liberal and tolerant, but beneath it, it's always based upon some core set of values, which they protect by violence if necessary.
Yes, yes, it's really interesting because I mean, I was just thinking when you said this, I didn't know that about Norway, and it's very interesting. But of course, this is absolutely the rule all throughout the world. Like, people always, or many Christians criticize the Muslims because their religion spread like over the entire Arab uh, what's the region and all of North Africa. Yes, the Orient, exactly, through violence, through the sword. But of course, it is the same everywhere. Like, and also if you read, for example, a little bit in the Old Testament, the whole history of mankind has been like this group of people with their god fighting against the other group of people with the other god, and then the one that wins also, like his god also wins, and then the losers have to convert or they are killed. And
right, so yeah.
No, go ahead.
You see this, yes, you see this throughout history that all the way there have been violence and conquest and war and violent protection of values that they have themselves. And of course, one could debate back and forth whether it was legitimate or illegitimate, was it justified or not. That's another discussion, a very complicated matter. But the point is that there has always been some violence at the basis of it. And that has, in most cases, contributing to making society form on some set of principles. And last time we talked about this, I also mentioned the Spanish Civil War as a very interesting scenario. And here you have a scenario where the libertarians, and also I would say the liberals, are in a dilemma. Because during the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, you had two sides. You had the nationalists and the Catholics and the conservatives, etc., on one side, and you had the left-wing Republicans, which included communists and anarcho-syndicalists and other radical groups. Those were the only two sides, either right-wing nationalism or left-wing socialism. And these two were fighting each other violently, very violently. And if you are in Spain and you're a libertarian or a liberal, you cannot just stay out of it altogether. You have to choose a side. Either you stay with the nationalists or the Republicans. That's the only way you can do anything productive, really. Even though none of these ideologies follow this old liberal principle of tolerance, etc., you still have to choose. So there's a very interesting scenario of a violent conflict that you cannot simply be completely neutral toward.
You are, and this is always the case. Like, it's the case for me now. If I should choose a society in which I want to live, in every society there are all kinds of things that I find suboptimal and would prefer if they were different. But I do not have the choice of the ideal society or where exactly my values are instantiated. So you always have to choose between suboptimal alternatives, and now at the moment this is maybe not so strikingly clear because we are not in a civil war, but in this example that you put, it's just exaggerated. Like, there it's really either you are with this group or you are with this group, or you are all on your own.
Right. You're seeing that there are problems there about violence that you can't simply ignore or just treat as it never existed. and it's getting increasingly so. So there might be the case that some decades into the future, people realize that democracy is untenable, it's unsustainable, and they need to replace it with some new system. And therefore, you would then see that some new set of values and beliefs will then dominate. So it's always this struggle for domination, in a sense, you could say. It reminds me almost a bit of Darwin's theory of evolution, that in nature you see this struggle for dominating the natural sphere of the ecology amongst animals, and also to some degree plants in their own world, you could say. And human societies are not that far away from that kind of environment, you could say. There is violence in nature, and you might admit that there is violence in human society as well. And this is something that several philosophers have pointed out, that we human beings, we are after all made out of nature. We are a part of nature. We are animals with a certain intellect and will, and of course we are superior in that we can know right from wrong and have some morality involved. But still, we have this tendency to use violence in many cases to achieve some ends, and it's based upon the general system of nature itself.
Yes, and the thing is, like, liberal or economists, I think they make a good argument that they say, for example, the free market is one way to solve organizational or even to some extent value discussions without violence. Or also voting and democracy, or that there are in theory ways to solve disputes without violence, and that these ways would actually lead to a superior solution, in the sense that it satisfies the desires of the people that are involved to a larger extent. But the thing that I start to grapple with is still underneath that there is the layer of violence. And violence is like the last word in the whole discussion. So even though you can solve certain questions through a mechanism like the free market, or like voting or whatever, still, what happens if the other group then doesn't conform to the solution that this mechanism has produced? Then you have only two options. Either you fight, or you let them basically not follow the agreed upon procedure, or even they force you to do the other thing, that even though the free market didn't produce this solution. So violence is like just the fundamental layer in the end.
Right, exactly. And I have been discussing with libertarians, and many of them seem to think that in a libertarian society, nobody would be imposing their values upon other people. But that just seems to me to be very false. First of all, when it comes to property rights would necessarily be enforced upon people who disagree. For instance, the communists. Think about an anarcho-syndicalist who believes that his co-workers at a factory, they legitimately own the factory because they work there. So the capitalist who really owns the factory, he's just a thief who steals them, who takes his profit is just a theft from their means of production, which they own. But according to the libertarians, the capitalist is the legitimate owner of that factory because he bought it, he invested money into it, and the co-workers, they are just working there. They're not owning the factory just because they are working with the means of production. But according to the communists and the anarcho-syndicalists, they are the legitimate owners. So here we have a real conflict. But libertarians would be, if necessary, use coercion. If, for instance, the anarcho-syndicalists throw the capitalists out of the factory, if they do revolution in the streets, they would use force. Many of them would use state force to suppress that, because they believe that's legitimate, because the communism is not a legitimate form of property rights, etc. But according to the communists, they are just defending themselves against thieves that are capitalists.
Yes,
So
that's a perfect example, because it shows that even the most basic conception of state power, just the night watchman state, it has an ideology behind it. It has a framework of values and a view of the world, which is that this stuff here is my property because I either collected it from nature or I bought it from someone else. And not everybody shares this view of property. And you can put many other examples, but it's not even necessary, because this example is perfectly sufficient to see that any form of societal organization has at its basis a set of axiomatically held values or beliefs or view of the world, and it is defended through violence, and it can't be any other way, because yes, it just, I can't see of a way how it could be different.
exactly. So and of course you could argue that that violence that libertarians espouse, they may argue that it's legitimate violence, that it's moral to use that violence. But nonetheless, it's still violence. They cannot deny that fact, that it is violence. Nonetheless, that's the nature of it. And by the way, for the audience, Amos and I, we were libertarians ourselves back in the day, and I believe many of these libertarian ideas. So we sort of know where the libertarian comes from, but yeah, as we say, we think they are wrong in some of their views about the world.
I think that an interesting question at this point is, what is then the methodology to find the best values? If I think most people would agree that certain values or certain way of organizing society seems preferable to them than other ways of organizing society. And what is then the best way of finding, like, of negotiating these different value systems against each other and deciding on how we want to structure our society? Because I don't think that violence is the best way to do this, but somehow it is a reality that cannot be denied. So I really have an open question there.
Right. That's a very interesting topic about what kind of strategy or approach should we use when we are presenting our own ideas about society and the world, etc. And of course, the reality right now is that we, people who are dissenting from the dominating liberal philosophy of today, we cannot use violence, obviously, because if we go around and use violence against people, we will be taken by the police and sent to jail. But let's imagine that we somehow got political power, that we got so popular with our ideas that we get elected into parliament or executive power or something like that. If we are in that kind of position, we are almost forced to use force, because governments are always backing their actions by some sort of force. And if the Libertarian Party, for instance, would reach political power, they would necessarily institute some system which would be based upon violence if people dissent from it. So libertarians might say, okay, we'll privatize that, we will deregulate that, etc., etc. But let's say there are local governments who disagree with that, or local bureaucrats who wants to keep the control of their own business or something. Then the libertarian government would use force if necessary for people who disagree about their views of property. Yes. And of course, as we talked about, the anarcho-syndicalists believing that, no, the factory is mine, I own it, I own the means of production, because I believe in the labor theory of value. Well, sorry, dude, you are going to be sent to jail if you don't follow our property rights. So that's the reality.
Yes, that's again a very good example, because you can imagine all kinds of steel workers and farmers and companies that produce for the military. They all have right now special law that backs them against foreign competition, for example. And they would perhaps go try to violently oppose a libertarian government, and the libertarian government could either enforce the libertarian view of property rights and thus fight these people, or they could close shop and go home, and there wouldn't be a libertarian government anymore, because the other people would take it over and would institute another kind of government that does enforce all of these protective laws and tariffs and everything. So
exactly, yeah. And I suspect that the libertarian system would also, or the liberal system, needs to go even further to really sustain itself. This liberal philosopher Karl Popper, he talked about this concept of the paradox of tolerance, which is a very interesting concept. That if you have a liberal society, which is all about tolerance, what would you do if there are some groups who are aggressive and they deny freedom of speech and tolerance? They are intolerant, and they desire political power for themselves to destroy that liberal tolerance altogether, to scratch it as soon as they get power. And they are espousing their views out in the streets, and they are doing their best to get to political power, even though they're doing it democratically. If you are a liberal or a democratic or a libertarian government, I imagine you would need to have to do something about that. Because if you don't suppress those groups, even though they are peaceful at the moment, if you don't stop them, at some point they might actually get political power and thereby destroy the whole system. So there is this thing about threats of potential destructions and aggression in the future. Take the Weimar Republic of Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, when the Nazis and the communists were gaining a lot of attention and support, and increasingly so. And everyone knew that if they got the power, they will establish a very hardcore dictatorship. And the liberal government at the time can't simply think, oh, we'll just let them go out in the streets, have parades, and make books and do whatever they want. Because realistically speaking, that government wouldn't last for very long. So you have the problem of tolerating the intolerant. It seems like a paradox, as Karl Popper put it.
Yes, I think that is in every case a very difficult question. But I just now I had also another interesting thought. I think that even if you look right now in our liberal state, most people are not really opposed to the use of violence to enforce their particular ideals. I heard once in a debate this phrase really stuck in my mind. Douglas Murray said it's like a sad realization for him that probably the Enlightenment never went really wide or really deep into the population. It was always a rather small group of mostly intellectuals and thinkers that subscribed to the Enlightenment values and philosophy. And I think also here in Switzerland, most people, like from the simpler levels of society, they don't really care about this whole abstract principle and don't use violence. And well, why? Sure, use violence if some idiot comes and doesn't follow what I obviously believe to be the right way of interacting. Just make him stop. And so because I was thinking, like, is there even a possibility of having a true dialogue about what ideology should govern society? Or is it just, yes.
Yeah, that's a very big question, you could say. Is it really possible to just use rational discourse and dialogue to come up with the right ideas? You could sort of say that Socrates tried that with the Socratic dialogue in old Athens, tried to persuade people to find the truth, the good, the beautiful, just by peaceful dialoguing. Unfortunately, it didn't go very well for Socrates, so he became a victim of violence himself and got the death penalty by the Athenian government. So that's been a very interesting issue, whether this is possible. Because we'd all desire that people would be rational and open and willing to dialogue and be open to new ideas. And theoretically speaking, it's possible to have that. But practically speaking, that's a tough one.
That's
tough one because people would always. Some people are rational, and some people are open to ideas. I believe many are to some degree, but there are very many people who might become somewhat irrational, especially when they have something at stake. For instance, there was a person the other day at a YouTube video or something who pointed out that if someone criticizes your political beliefs or religious beliefs or philosophy, some people might take it as an attack on their very identity. So they might act and respond irrationally and just attack back and or refuse to even consider opposing ideas because they consider the attack on their ideas as an attack on themselves. And of course, the other problem that people could be vulnerable to demagogues, to people making emotional appeals so that the ideas sound very good. So there's a lot of problems which make it very difficult to really just persuade people into believing the correct ideas, even though it's theoretically possible. So yeah, it's a hard one. I suppose people would just have to be when you try to meet someone else and try to persuade their mind, you just have to be as open, friendly, and respectful as possible, and just talk with him for a long time, because I believe very few people will get convinced of an entire another idea just at a second. It will take a long time before people actually began to changing deep beliefs and opinions. That's a very gradual process. So yeah, I would just say I'm not sure whether that's practically achievable. I hope so, of course, but yeah, there's a lot of problems that may be obstacles.
Yes, I really agree with what you said, and maybe this is a good point to end this first video that we made together. Maybe also ask the audience what they think. Is it possible to really have a rational dialogue in society or between societies about what the values should be that we live by? Or, because in theory it's possible, we know that, but is it actually in practice possible? Or is it always somehow in the end more or less directly based on violence.
Exactly.
So,
Very, very good point. So yeah, the audience, if they have some answers to this, please just comment in the section below. And yeah, I suppose we could just talk about it another day as well.
yes,
Because
yes.
it's a very important topic as well.
Yes, I agree.
So,
It's maybe even one of the most important topics at the moment.
yeah, exactly. So, well, it seems like we have talked a lot about that very interesting and fascinating topic about society and philosophy and dialogues and strategies. I suppose this video will be published both at your YouTube channel and my own. For those of you who don't know, my YouTube channel is Creative Christoffer. You could just find it when you search Creative Christoffer at YouTube. Christoffer with CH, and you'll just find me there. And yeah, for those who may know me but not know your channel, maybe perhaps you could talk a little bit about your own channel so that they might check that out too.
Yes, my channel is Amos Zweig. It's just my full name, but we will certainly put both of the links in the description, so you can find also the work that the other conversation partner is doing. Yes, so I thank you very much for this conversation. It's cool that we met, and it's cool that we did this, and I hope to repeat it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been very enjoyable. And yeah, we'll make a new one video soon, sometime, and talk about something new, I hope. And of course, if any of you at the audience have any ideas to topics and another video, please share those thoughts in the comment section.
Yes, perfect. Okay,
Great.
So take care, and I'll see you on another video.
Yeah, see you too.